Welcome everyone to Daf Yomi, 1 week at a time. We are in the middle of Masechet Yevamot, and today is our 7th class where we will be reviewing Daf 44 through 50. This week we are going to be talking about a few different topics. It won't be our usual, four brothers. Well, we are going to start with four brothers, but we're not going to have a lot of cases. We are going to go in a little bit of a different direction this week, and we're going to be talking about conversion. So we will see where this takes us. So welcome everyone. Let's go to the Mishnah. We're actually going to start at the Mishnah at the bottom of Daf 43. The Mishnah begins with telling us that if there were four brothers and they were all married, and then they die, so then the oldest brother can do yibum with all of these women. Now, of course, you're going to say that doesn't make sense. If there are four brothers and they all die, who's doing yibum? The Gemara is going to tell us really there were more brothers, probably six, at least six, but four of them were married. All four of them die, so then the oldest remaining brother can actually marry all four women, meaning he can do yibum to all four women. The Mishnah continues that a person married to two women, if one does yibum or chalitza, the co-wife is exempt. Now, if this sounds familiar to you, it's important to understand that unlike other, maybe we can say academic works or even other halachic works, the Talmud is not really a let's start at the very beginning kind of a text. Meaning, what do I mean by that? That the fundamental ideas or concepts generally are introduced only at the middle or even at the end of the Masechet. The assumption is that all of you have already learned all of the Mishnayot. Sometimes that is the case, but sometimes it is not the case. And therefore, we're going to see actually here, right, these are concepts we've already seen from the beginning of the Masechet, but this is the source. So this Mishnah tells us that if a man had two women, you do not do yibum with both women. You do yibum to one woman or chalitza. The other woman, the co-wife, is exempt. The top of 44 tells us that if, let's say we have these two women as possibilities to do yibum, if one woman can marry a kohen, meaning she was not a divorcee from beforehand, and the other one, let's say, cannot marry a kohen, then if you're going to do chalitza with the woman who already can't marry a kohen. Because we're going to see, and we have mentioned this before, that a chalutza, a woman who did chalitza, she is like a divorcee, and she cannot marry a kohen. So the Mishnah tells us if you're already going to I don't want to use the word mess her up, but let's say not, make her ineligible to marry a kohen, you might as well do it to the woman who already can't marry a kohen. And if you're going to do yibum with the one who is kasher, who is able to do yibum. Okay, again, the Gemara on Daf 44 tells us, as I mentioned already, there aren't just four brothers, there are more brothers, and therefore the court is giving advice to the Yavam, to the brother. The advice that he gives is, in general, you should only do yibum with one woman. But if you can support more than one woman, the maximum you should do is four. You shouldn't do more than, you shouldn't do yibum with more than four women. Then it becomes very complicated. And therefore, four should be the maximum. Okay, then again, as we mentioned, you only do yibum or chalitza with one of the wives. The other is exempt. The next Mishnah tells us that, okay, so just a concept here. When a person gets divorced, they can remarry that woman as long as she hasn't remarried someone else in the middle. If she has remarried someone else, then if she gets divorced, she cannot return to the original husband. That is called Mamzer grushato. So that relationship is prohibited. Or another prohibited relationship is to marry the woman you did chalitza with. Again, as I mentioned, there's parallels to a divorcee and the chalutza. The chalutza, a woman who you did chalitza with, you are not allowed, right? Again, the idea is you didn't want to do yibum. So now that you distance yourself from her, you cannot marry her. Again, she was your brother's wife, so you cannot marry her. So if, let's say, you do marry one of, right, if a man does marry one of these women, or, right, her relative, again, the chalutza, the woman he did chalitza with, her relatives are also prohibited. He needs to divorce her. And if they have a child, that child is a mamzer. A mamzer, I think we mentioned this last time, but we will see it more this week and next week. A mamzer, again, the translation is an illegitimate child, but that's not what it means. And we'll see now and again later on. First of all, this is a very severe case, and there are different opinions what creates a mamzer. So again, if you use the word illegitimate, that usually means right out of wedlock. That is not the case here. The case here is, again, as I mentioned, marrying the Mamzer grushato, marrying a woman you were divorced from who remarried somebody else in the interim. If you remarried them, or the chalutza or her relatives, Rabbi Akiva says that child is a mamzer. The sages say that child is not a mamzer. And we're going to see the Mishnah that this is based on in a few minutes. But the child from a relative of his divorcee is a mamzer, and the Gemara is going to explain this. So the Gemara tells us on Daf 44 that the sister of the divorcee is forbidden on a biblical level, deoraita, on the biblical level, but the sister of the chalutza, right, of a woman you did chalitza with, that is on a rabbinic level. So the Gemara says, how could that be that Rabbi Akiva would say that that child is a mamzer? So the Gemara says, you're right. Change it to the relative of the divorcee, not the relative of the chalutza. And here the Gemara explains that according to Rabbi Akiva, any child that is a product of a forbidden relationship, and that forbidden relationship is even just a negative commandment, that child is a mamzer, according to Rabbi Akiva. But the sages say, excuse me, the sages say no. The forbidden relationships that create a child that's a mamzer is a relationship where the punishment is karet, which is much more stringent. And I don't know if I mentioned this, but what does it mean that the child is a mamzer? It means that the child cannot marry a regular Jewish woman. The child can marry another mamzer, but again, we'll see also later on there's a discussion on who they can marry. So this is quite complicated. Okay, the Gemara says that the child of the Mamzer grushato, the woman who was divorced and then remarried, that child cannot marry a kohen. So here the Gemara explains it's not a mamzer, rather it's pagum. Excuse me. Give me 1 second. Okay, sorry. So the Gemara introduces another term. The term is pagum, which means, let's say, disqualified from certain things, right? Not mamzer, not as severe, but a less severe case, meaning they can't marry whoever they want, but they can marry pretty much anyone except for a priest, a kohen. Um, Okay. The sages say no. That this child is kasher. The child is fine. It is not a mamzer again. But yes, but correct. Sorry, that the sages agree that it is that child is not allowed to marry a kohen. Um, Okay, the Gemara then says that everyone agrees that the child of a non Jewish slave and a Jewish woman is a mamzer, or a child of a non Jew plus a Jewish woman is a mamzer. This is not true, or I should say, this is not the law. Even though it says here everyone agrees, the next daf 44, 45 says that is not the case. So, it's, I think it's interesting, especially when we're learning daf Yomi, you're left on, I actually taught to my group this daf 44, and it says, everybody agrees. And I said, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. I don't think that that's the law. So we had to wait till the next day on daf 45 to tell us that that is not the case. So daf 45, Rabbi Shimon Hatimni agrees that where betrothal kiddushin doesn't work, then the child is a mamzer. Or the Gemara says no. Rabbi Shimon Hatimni says that that's not the case. It's only a child of forbidden relationships that the punishment is karet, which is much more severe. Okay, so here the Gemara tells us, again, we're discussing the child of a Jewish woman and a non-Jew, or a non-Jew who is a slave. And here it's actually a machloket in the Gemara, whether that child is a mamzer or not. It seems that 4 sages say the child is a mamzer, 4 sages say the child is completely fine, and that is actually the halacha, that the child is completely fine. Though some say, right, the Gemara says that that child cannot marry a kohen or work as a kohen, meaning if that child is from a kohen family, that child would not be a kohen. If a non-Jew has relations with a Jewish woman, so the Gemara says that she is, again, pasul to a kohen, meaning she cannot marry a kohen if she has relations with a non-Jew. Again, as I mentioned, Rebbe says that the child is fine, is kasher, and can marry a kohen. So it's interesting here. There's a story that a man comes to Rav and says, this is my lineage, and Rav says, oh, that child can marry anyone. And then he says, oh, great, can I marry your daughter? And Rav is like, no, you cannot marry my daughter. So it's actually a very interesting story. It seems that he's trying to, I don't know if the word is provoke him, or, the way we say, prove that this is really how you feel. But interestingly, he would not give him his daughter. The Gemara says that if a person, a man who is half a slave and half a free man, the idea is that basically he is owned by 2 people. One of them frees him, the other one doesn't, so he's half a slave. What if he has relations with a Jewish woman? So that child is kasher, and that would be okay. The Gemara says that if he betroths her, so that's interesting, right? Because half of him is is now, it's interesting, right? The free half can betroth her and be with her, but the slave half can't be with the other half. That's she becomes like almost a married woman from the other side, which makes things very complicated. So the Gemara says maybe that child is a mamzer, and the Gemara says no, that child isn't a mamzer. The Gemara continues and says that again it becomes complicated. There's a story with a slave and a single woman, and the Gemara tells us that the child is kasher. But if she was a married woman, then the child is a mamzer. And the Gemara tells us the halacha, the law is that the child is kasher, and therefore the child is not a mamzer. And the Gemara continues and gives us an example of somebody who has a Jewish mother, and the father was non-Jewish, and the Gemara tells us that he's kosher. He's totally seen as a regular member of society, so much more that he's appointed a community leader to show really that he's accepted. The Gemara tells us that a non-Jewish woman who went to the mikvah and she wanted to go to the mikvah so she could have relations with a slave owned by a Jew. And then Rav Yosef said, both she and her child can marry Jews. Right? And we see here that her immersion in the mikvah can be seen as conversion, and therefore she becomes full-fledged Jewish, and the child is also Jewish as well. And here we're going to now segue into a conversation about conversion. What's important to understand is conversion nowadays might be seen as different than in those days. And another thing which we'll see in a minute is the idea of slavery. We're going to talk about slavery in Judaism. Again, I don't think we'll see here the way slaves are treated, which I think they're treated with respect, but it is important to understand that according to Jewish law, when a person buys a non-Jewish slave, that non-Jew is put in the mikvah in order to be, I guess the word is partially converted. The idea is that as long as this slave is in a Jewish home, he takes upon himself, or is forced upon, that's a question which we're going to see in a minute, to keep certain mitzvot, certain commandments. So it's interesting to understand that these slaves were seen as part of the household, and therefore were seen as Jewish or partially Jewish. So much so that when they were freed, they were, again, some of them, seen as completely 100% Jewish. So it's an interesting perspective. Another question is how long, we definitely see, and we just saw a story of, we will see that in the time of the Mishnah and even in the Gemara, it seems that they did own slaves, whether it's in Israel or in Bavel. There seems to be slavery. What that means, I don't know if it means indentured servitude or workers, but the word slave or eved is mentioned in the Gemara. So I'm not, judging, but it's interesting to understand what the times were like and what that meant for Jewish law. So the Gemara says that if a person goes to the mikvah at some point for whatever reason, it could be for marital ritual purity, then that could also be seen as the mikvah experience for conversion as well, which is interesting because, again, nowadays we see conversion and mikvah as a very conscious, intentional experience, which, again, we will see in the Gemara as well. But interestingly, the Gemara seems to be implying that maybe if it isn't as intentional, or maybe it's intentional from one person, it works. So we'll see what the case was. Let's say when someone buys a slave and then he puts him in the mikvah, that person, the slave, if he's smart, he can acquire himself when he goes to the mikvah, and he will come out of the mikvah a free man. So the Gemara explains this on Daf 46, that because the owner only, right, he does, when he buys the non-Jewish slave from a non-Jew, so according to Jewish law, a non-Jew can't own the body of another non-Jew. Therefore, when you buy a slave from a non-Jew, you're only buying the working rights, not his body. And therefore, when he goes into the mikvah, he can, right, say to himself, I want to be Jewish and free. And when he comes out of the mikvah, he he is seen as a free person if that was the intent that he has. So it's interesting to see that the power that the mikvah gives to this slave. The Gemara says also for a non-Jewish, right? Oh, the Gemara gives a story about a woman who was non-Jewish and she owned slaves, and she decides she's going to convert. So the Gemara tells us that if the slaves go to the mikvah before she converts, then basically they're free, because when they come out of the mikvah, she didn't convert yet, so there's nobody who owns them, and therefore they go free. But if she converts first, then she still owns them. So again, we said a non-Jew can't buy a Jew as a slave, right? Again, he can't own his body. He can buy the work that he's going to do. And again, as we said, when the Jewish owner puts the slave into the mikvah, right? So if he does it by pressing down on him. That is what's called right. He's converting him in order to become his slave. Again, I think these are difficult concepts. When we're thinking about social justice, and I think the concept of slavery is so foreign to us. But again, the way I see it is, first of all, it seems that this is something that was done then, and two, it seems that we're trying to do it as humanely as possible, if one could say that. But okay, I'm going to stop here. Let's keep going. Okay. Interestingly, the Gemara talks about when someone, it seems there was a town where, or an area where you needed to pay a certain head tax. And if a Jew paid the non-Jew's head tax instead of him, they became his slaves till they paid off the debt. And the Gemara says that this is actually the law of the land, not Jewish law, but the law of the land, and that's how that worked. And from here, the Gemara is going to talk a little bit more about conversion. So there's a story that Rabbi Chia went to a town, and he saw that there were women who became pregnant by converts who had circumcision, they had brit milah, but they hadn't gone to the mikvah. So it's important to understand that according to Jewish law, conversion is let's say a three-step process, but really a three-step process in the time of the temple actually included bringing a sacrifice. Nowadays, we don't have that, but a man has to do circumcision, and a woman obviously does not, and they both need to go into the mikvah and accept all the commandments and God as their God, right, as our God. So here the Gemara says, well, what if someone did circumcision but didn't go to the mikvah? Are they seen as Jews or not? Rabbi Yochanan said that their children are mamzerim. Again, not really, but he said it as a blanket statement because he felt that, because he says that for conversion, right, Jewish law, you need to have both circumcision and going into the mikvah. Um, and it continues by saying that if you didn't go to the mikvah and only did circumcision, it's a machloket. There's a disagreement if he's really considered a convert. What if he went to the mikvah without doing circumcision? Everybody agrees that that is not a convert. And the end of the discussion is we need both, right? Circumcision and immersion in the mikvah. Okay. So from here, the Gemara is now trying to understand, where do we get this concept that a convert needs to do circumcision, brit milah, and immerse in the mikvah? So the Gemara goes back to Har Sinai, to Mount Sinai, when we accepted the Ten Commandments, the Torah. And here the Gemara says that the Jewish people actually immersed before they received the Torah, and therefore you see that they immersed. The Gemara says, well, they also did brit milah, they did circumcision before they left Egypt, or the women went to the mikvah before they left Egypt even, and the Gemara says that again, certain sages learn it from different parts of that story of leaving Egypt and accepting the Torah. And from here, the Gemara then goes into a discussion about, are you allowed to go to, let's say you did circumcision before as part of the process, can you go to the mikvah on Shabbat? If it is a pivotal part of conversion, so then you would not be allowed to do it on Shabbat, because you're actually changing a person's status, and you shouldn't do that on Shabbat. But if it's just like a bonus, and really circumcision is the conversion itself, then you would be able to do it on Shabbat. And the Gemara says no, they are equally important, and therefore you are not allowed to do it on Shabbat. The Gemara teaches a story and says that basically from this story, you see that you need 3 people to convert. So this is just very, very interesting that at the time of conversion, there need to be 3 men at the different parts of the process. They are a court, a beit din, and they are there to witness the process. So you need 3 people, you need circumcision, and you need mikvah, exactly as we had mentioned before. What if someone comes and says, I'm a convert, do you accept him right away or not? So the Gemara says that if he has a reputation that he converted already, right, the word in the Gemara is a chazaka. Chazaka means that they are known, there's already they have a reputation that they're Jewish now, so then we accept them as being Jewish. But if not, so then you need to do more research. You don't just believe them right away. But if the person comes with witnesses, so then you believe them. And this is in Israel and even anywhere else. So the Gemara says maybe you believe him in outside of Israel, even without witnesses, because, right, the Gemara's point is, who would want to convert outside of Israel, right? It's so hard to be a Jew. So if he's already saying, he or she, are saying that they converted, so obviously, like, they wouldn't lie about it, because why would they want to be Jewish? You know, it's so hard. Or no, again, maybe these witnesses are not witnesses that say that they were at the conversion process. Rather, they say, we heard that this person converted. So again, we say this we believe in Israel, and that is based on a verse. but in outside of Israel, you need to bring witnesses that were actually there. um, okay. What about someone who says that they converted by themselves, not with a Beit Din, not with a court? The Gemara says that that is not acceptable. You need to do it with a community, with a court. People need to have been involved in the process. A man comes and says that he converted by himself. Rabbi Yehuda says that he can basically disqualify himself, but not his children. His children are seen as Jewish, but not right, but not he himself. Or maybe even he can disqualify his children, but not his grandchildren. And from here on Daf 47, the Gemara describes the conversion process. Right, so here, and in case you are not familiar, right, Judaism is not a proselytizing religion. We do not go door to door asking people to convert. We do not try to convince people to convert. So much so that the Gemara tells us here on Daf 47 that when a convert comes and says that they want to convert, you try to discourage the person, right? You say, well, just realize that it's really hard to be Jewish, right? And then, right, they say, we tell them about hard, right? And they say, no, I don't care. I want to be Jewish. So then the Gemara says, now you tell the person about the easy commandments and the difficult commandments, right? You don't sugarcoat anything, and you don't only tell them the hardest things. You tell them everything, or, kind of a summary of things, and you tell them that there are punishments for these commandments, and you say to them, right, till now you could eat a cheeseburger and nothing happened to you, but now you want to be Jewish, and then if you eat a cheeseburger, there's going to be consequences. That's what you want. And then you also tell them about the rewards, right? And I think this is just important. I think some people feel or think that we push converts away very forcefully, and the Gemara says you have to find a balance, right? You push a little bit, but you also say there are obviously good things about being Jewish. You don't scare them too much. You also don't overwhelm them. And if the person accepts it, right? If it's a man, you give them a circumcision. When he heals, he goes to the mikvah, and in the mikvah, he needs to accept all the commandments. And then we accept this person fully. And I think that this line is extremely important. It's very important to understand as Jewish people, yes, we talked about discouraging converts, but as soon as someone comes and says that they are honestly and earnestly want to be part of the Jewish people, we embrace them. We should love and support people who have converted, and I think that this is, I found in my life, the converts that I met are so inspirational that it's just so important to make them feel a part of the Jewish people and really gain inspiration from them. So I just think it's incredible. Again, the same thing with a woman, says the Gemara. Again, with going into the mikvah, she needs to accept all the mitzvot. When you go into the mikvah, we have the same laws as when you go in for family purity, for taharat mishpacha. There can't be anything that prevents the water from touching the body. And the Gemara says also when a person is converting, you need to teach them about the laws of charity, right? This is an important value for the Jewish people, and therefore, right, if you don't do it, there will be consequences. And from here, there's a beautiful piece about the verses that Ruth says to Naomi, and I think this is beautiful as we are in the time period between Pesach and Shavuot. So here the Gemara on Daf 47 goes through the beautiful verses that Ruth says to Naomi, right? Wherever you go, I will go, and your God is my God. But what's interesting is the Gemara makes it into a conversation. The conversation is Naomi is trying to say, why do you want to be Jewish, right? Everything is complicated. And Ruth says, I'll do whatever you do, right? So, right, she says, right, she's trying to discourage her, and she says, just stop discouraging me. Wherever you go, I will go, and your God is my God, and wherever you will be buried, I will be buried. And basically, she accepts everything that Naomi tells her. Which is interesting. I think the Gemara is putting this in because if you just read those verses, it seems like Ruth says, okay, I'll be Jewish, and Naomi's like, okay, fine. We don't really see a process. So I think it's interesting that the Gemara is putting in almost like a conversion class in those verses, is kind of like filling in the conversation for us. The Gemara says, again, right, we don't wait. As soon as they decide that this is what they want to do, they go into the mikvah. And we said that once you become a full-fledged Jew, you don't go back, which means, and this is, I think, just very interesting, that if, let's say, 5 years later, the convert decides not to be religious anymore, some people think that that reverses the conversion. It does not. It does not reverse the conversion. That person will always be a Jew. So that's just interesting to understand. Here, the Gemara now says that it's a machloket if a freed slave needs to accept mitzvot, the commandments, when he goes into the mikvah, right? It might be automatic. And here's what I mentioned earlier, that when a non-Jewish slave is bought by a Jew, that non-Jewish slave becomes quasi-Jewish with a certain assumption that they will keep certain commandments. The Gemara says they keep commandments like a woman, meaning non-time-bound commandments. And then when they're freed, they either automatically become full-fledged Jewish or, again, go to the mikvah and have to accept upon themselves to become Jewish. The Gemara says that on Daf 48, that the slave does circumcision as well. Maybe without his consent, maybe with his consent. Then we continue that if you renounce ownership from your slave, then you don't need to give that slave a document of freedom. It's called a get shichrur, which means a get is, right, sounds like get from a divorce paper, but here it's, and we'll see when we get to Gittin, this is often discussed in parallel when a woman gets divorced and when a slave is set free. I am not drawing parallels. The halacha draws parallels in terms of the mechanism, not more than that. But the slave needs a document to say that they have been set free. But if you renounce ownership, you don't need that document. So we continue that the Gemara says that if you buy a slave from a non-Jew, then that slave needs to accept mitzvot. But if you buy it from a Jew, then he does not. From here, the Gemara discusses the woman who's called an Eshet Yifat Toar. This is discussed in the Torah. The idea is that a man who goes out to war and sees a beautiful non-Jewish woman, he can take her, but he needs to wait 30 days in order to marry her. She needs to mourn for her family, and she has to, either grow her hair or shave her hair. She needs to cut her nails or grow her nails. But here, and she needs to wait 30 days or maybe 90 days. So this is seen as a parallel to the non-Jewish slave who now becomes owned by a Jew. So the Gemara says that if you have a slave, that slave needs to be circumcised. It's interesting, or maybe they can choose to not be circumcised. The Gemara says that everyone in your property needs to rest on Shabbat. So again, if you think about, slavery, the way we understand slavery, I don't know how much rest they were doing. So I'm choosing to understand this as a different type of slavery. And here, the Gemara says that you should try to convince your slave for 12 months to convert. We want them to be part of the Jewish people in some way. And if not, after 12 months, you need to sell the slave back. Or, if he says that at the time that you bought him, he says he'll convert, but then he changes his mind, again, maybe you can keep him, or maybe you have to sell him back. The Gemara tells us that after the destruction of the temple, many people wanted to convert. And it seems that their lives were very difficult, and maybe it was because they weren't really careful with keeping the commandments, or maybe because they converted out of fear. But it seems that these people were not really accepted as true converts, because it seems that they it seems that the Gemara says that their lives were difficult. So the Gemara says, why were their lives difficult? It must be that they didn't really convert with proper intentions. Okay, the Gemara on Daf 49 goes back to the concept of Mamzer. I told you we were coming back to that. So Rabbi Akiva tells us that, as I mentioned, a Mamzer is the child who's a product of any forbidden relationship that is forbidden as a negative prohibition, a lav. That's a pretty lower bar, not very strict in terms of punishment. Rabbi Shimon HaTimni says it's forbidden relationships with the punishment of karet. Again, karet is a very severe punishment of God cutting you off. There's some sort of death involved, but it's divine. Rabbi Yoshua says it's only relationships where you can actually get capital punishment, which is fewer cases. The Mishnah tells us that they found a scroll that supports Rabbi Yoshua's opinion, even though the sages say that the law goes according to Rabbi Shimon HaTimni, which is according to the idea of karet and not of a regular negative prohibition. The Mishnah continues that if a man's wife dies, he can then marry her sister. If he divorces her and then she dies, he can marry her sister. If he did yibum and then she dies, then he can marry her sister. The bottom line is, when she dies, he can marry her sister. The Gemara is going to ask why we needed this redundancy. The Gemara is going to answer, it's redundant. We didn't really need this. But the same thing with chalitza. If he does chalitza to a woman, he cannot marry her sister. But if she dies, he can, and etc. So the Gemara tells us that the verse of Mamzer, again, where it is in the Torah, is after the prohibitions of sleeping with the father's wife. This is actually, we read it last week. Those of you outside of Israel will be reading it this Shabbat in Achremot. You have in chapter 18 all the forbidden relationships. You will recognize that, by the way. These are all the things that we've been talking about. So that's this week's Parsha for those of you outside of Israel. Basically after the discussion of these forbidden relationships, 2 verses later, it says that a mamzer, a child who's a mamzer, cannot marry into Israel. Now, the Torah doesn't tell us who is a mamzer. So here the Gemara is trying to interpret who is a mamzer, and again, based on this verse. So either it's because the verse is talking about sleeping with the father's wife, or it's talking about a woman that he raped, and then that would be karet, or a negative prohibition. It could be that it's either a woman that he raped or a woman who's waiting to do yibum. So everyone learns it from the same verse. The question is, how do you understand that verse? The Gemara tells us that if you have relations with a woman who is in nida, who is ritually impure, she has her, she is menstruating, or she is a sota. Sota is a woman who is married and her husband suspects her of having an affair, and there are witnesses who saw something, but we're not sure exactly what they saw. So that is a sota. We'll talk more about her when we get to that masachet. But everyone agrees that the child with either one of these women is not a mamzer. Because one could betroth these women, Kiddushin does work with these women, and therefore the child is not a mamzer. So too a shomeret yavam, meaning a woman who's waiting for yibum. If let's say she then has a child with somebody else, not the yavam, that child is not a mamzer. That scroll of lineage that was found said that the child of a woman who was married and had a child with another man, that child is a mamzer. And it also said that the teachings of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov are, the term in the Gemara is kav v'naki. Kav is a very small measurement, and naki means clean, but here I think it means pure, right? So what is this idea? That the teachings of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov are small in number, but they're very pure. He preserved the tradition, and when he teaches in a very pure form. And the scroll also said that King Menashe killed Yeshayahu the prophet. So the Gemara explains, this is from the Navi, that, right, if you remember, King Menashe is a terrible king. He is basically the worst king ever, and he actually kills his grandfather, who is Yeshayahu the prophet. The Gemara describes that he puts him on trial, and he determines that he's actually a false prophet, which he was not, and he executes him. And he accuses Yeshayahu for going against Moshe. And he says, Moshe said that you cannot see God clearly, and you said you saw God clearly, so you must be lying. And the Gemara goes through each one of these things and explains how obviously he was not lying, right? Moshe saw God clearly. All other prophets saw him in a hazy way, right? In the Aramaic term is aspaklaria, mi'ira, which is right clearly, or eina mi'ira, not clearly, right? Moshe, who is the greatest prophet, saw God in however a human person can see God in the clearest way. All other prophets saw God more through in a hazy way, right? Not very clear. The other thing he said is that you can always find God, and Yeshayahu says, every person needs to search and look hard for God. So Yeshayahu says, right, or excuse me, the Gemara explains, right, that when Moshe says God is always there, that's for the community. God will always be there for a community. But for the individual, there are times where God is easier to find. What are these times? Right, the 10 days of repentance, right? The 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We talk about this time as being an auspicious time for prayer, for repentance, and that is what he was talking about. The next idea is that Moshe says that God gives us a certain number of years to live, and Yeshayahu basically says that Chizkiyahu the Melech, the king, when he did tshuva, when he repented, he got 15 years added to his life. So the Gemara says, right, so Menashe said, how could it be that he had 15 years added to his life? Moshe says, we have a certain number of years. So here the Gemara says, right, there's actually a machloket, right? are we destined to live a certain number of years, and then if we merit, to fulfill our maximum potential, and if not, then it's fewer years, or the opposite. We're given a certain number of years, and if we merit, we get bonus, and if we do not merit, right, we get less. And that is the discussion there. And with that, we finish the fourth chapter in Masechet Yevamot. We will now begin the fifth chapter with the Mishnah on Daf 50. Okay, so here we're going back to discuss Yibum and Chalitza, and we are also going to discuss doing things, let's say, in different order. So let's just understand, right? We talked about there are two options. Chalitza means you don't want to do Yibum, right? Or you can do Yibum or Chalitza. Those are the biblical commandments, and on a biblical level, those are your choices, Yibum or Chalitza. We also discussed two other things that you could do. Ma'amar. Remember, Ma'amar was a betrothal for Yibum, which means it's one step closer to Yibum. This is on a rabbinic level, right? You haven't done Yibum yet, but you're doing something close to Yibum. Another thing that you can do is give a get, which we saw briefly, but here we're going to see much more. What if you give a get, right? A get doesn't work. It's not Chalitza, right? But if you give a get, it means you don't want to do Yibum. So it's a step closer to Chalitza. So it's important to understand, Yibum and Chalitza are on a biblical level, deoraita. Ma'amar and get are something you can do on a dirabanan, on a rabbinic level. So now we're going to talk about, we're going to get a little complicated. Here we go. Rabban Gamliel tells us that you can't give a get after someone already gave a get. Meaning, once you gave a get, giving another get from another person is superfluous. It doesn't work. So too ma'amar, or having relations, which means yibum, or chalitza, meaning according to Ramban Gamliel, once you do one of those things, if someone does it also, or if you maybe do it again, we'll see in a minute, it doesn't work. It's as if you didn't do anything. The sages say that get and ma'amar can be followed by get and ma'amar. Remember, these things are on a rabbinic level, therefore they're not so strong. So you could do it again. We'll see what that means in a minute. However, yibum and chalitza, once you do that, there's nothing that comes afterwards. Okay, so those are the things you have to remember. And now we're going to go through a very long list. We're basically we're going to do all the Mishnayot of the fifth chapter now on this daf, and then we're going to break it up in the Gemara. So here we go. The Gemara says, what if a person did ma'amar, and then he gave a get? So now, again, he did two weak things, and they're the opposites. So the Gemara says, if you do ma'amar, and then you do get, so that woman needs chalitza, right? Because you basically said, I want to do yibum, but then you said, I don't want to do yibum, so now you have to do chalitza. Okay, what if you did ma'amar and chalitza? She still needs a get because you did ma'amar. So we need something that breaks up the ma'amar, and it's enough to do the get. What if you do ma'amar and then yibum? So the Gemara is like, the Mishnah even says, that's the mitzvah. You do ma'amar, and then you do yibum. Great, done. Okay, next case. You do get, so you pushed away, then you do ma'amar. So now you need to do get because of the ma'amar, right? So you went one step closer, but now you can't marry her either, so you need to do get for that ma'amar, and then you need to do chalitza because you didn't do chalitza yet. So there needs to be chalitza as well. What if you do get and then yibum? So interestingly, she needs a get because again, you're messing up everything, and she needs chalitza. Okay, what if you did get and chalitza? She doesn't need anything. Okay, and we'll understand why in a minute. Okay, now let's get more complicated. You did chalitza, ma'amar, get, and yibum. Okay, or we'll change the order. Yibum, ma'amar, get, chalitza. She doesn't need anything. Um, and the Gemara is going to explain why afterwards. Next, this applies. So this is very interesting, right? Because if you were thinking who's doing what to who, that's an excellent question. So the Mishnah tells us this applies where there are two women and one man, right? So maybe he did one to one and one to the other, right? Or, right, or again, two men and one woman, and we'll see how that's going to work. The Gemara, the Mishnah continues. If he did ma'amar to two women, right? Again, they're two women, and one man did ma'amar to both of them, so they both need a get, and one needs chalitza. In case it wasn't clear, the first cases that we did was one man, one woman, and he just did two things to her. Now we have one man, two women. So they both need a get, but only one needs chalitza, because remember we said only one person needs chalitza, not both of them. What if he did ma'amar to one and get to another? So then one needs a get, right? Ma'amar woman needs a get, and the get woman needs chalitza, right? Because again, we need to have chalitza or yibum at the end. What if he did ma'amar to one and yibum to the other? So now again, it's a problem because he did two different things to two different women. So they both need a get, and one of them needs chalitza because that yibum didn't work. What if he does ma'amar to one and chalitza to the other? So the ma'amar woman needs a get, and one second. The first one needs a get. If he gave a get to both of them, so then they both need chalitza. Okay, if you're not confused, wait, I see a comment. Oh, a big comment. 1 second. What if the overseeing Beitin was found later to have abandoned their observance since the sincere okay, wait, we'll get to conversion in a minute. I'll get back to you in a minute. Let's finish with this. Okay, let's go to next. We again two women. He gives a get to one and does yibum with the other. So then he needs to give a get and chalitza. What if he did get to one and ma'amar to the other? Again, he needs to do get and chalitza. One of them needs chalitza. If he did get to one and chalitza to the other, you don't need anything. And here the Gemara says that, or the Mishnah, sorry, as long as he does chalitza or yibum, you don't need anything afterwards, meaning that's the end of the process. And again, here the Mishnah tells us, even if it's one man with two Yevamot, two women, or two men and one Yavam, right? Either way, two men and one woman, right? One Yevama with two men, meaning each brother gives her something. All of these cases still apply. The Mishnah tells us that it doesn't matter if the chalitza is at the beginning, the middle, or the end of this process. As soon as it's done, it's finished. That's the end. If yibum is first, so then there's nothing after it. But if it's in the middle or at the end, then you do need to do something else. And we saw that there's chalitza afterwards. Rabbi Nehemiah says it could be anywhere. You don't need anything after yibum. And let's just do a little bit of the Gemara, and then we'll finish this up. The Gemara says there's a machloket. If the machloket in the beginning about get after get with one man and one woman. Here the Gemara says the machloket is only with one woman who's given one get and then another get. But if one get is effective to prevent him from doing yibum and ma'amar from chalitza, so then, again, as we said, ma'amar and get are on a rabbinic level, right? So if he did ma'amar to one woman and yibum to the other, this is called bia psula, meaning I don't want to use the word invalid because that's what the word means, but let's say a lower level yibum. And therefore, if he does ma'amar to one and yibum to the other, she needs chalitza because that yibum was not good because he did ma'amar to the right. He did yibum to the wrong woman, right? He did ma'amar to one and then did yibum to the other. So we're going to pick this up next week. I hope I did not complicate you or confuse you too much. But I see Lynn has a question about conversion. So let's see. What if the overseeing Beit Din was found later to have abandoned their observance? Are the sincere converts during their oversight still Jewish on their own standing without controversy? On their own standing without controversy from other communities. This really happens, and the chain of witnesses in the modern era is so fragile and breaks down on so many social upheavals in today's confusions. Yes, it is an excellent question. It is very complicated. Unfortunately, there have been terrible stories about rabbinic figures who have been on courts and it did lead to people questioning the converts that they converted. I think it's very complicated. It's very complicated. Yeah, I don't know how to answer that. I think there are different rules and different laws dealing with this. I have unfortunately met people who this has happened to. Unfortunately, they do ask usually the people in question to maybe go into the mikvah again. It's generally just a precaution. Unfortunately, it really gives a very negative feeling to that convert, right? They say, I've been Jewish for the past 10 years. Why are you questioning, my commitment? It is very complicated. It is very complicated. And unfortunately, these things, it's very hard, I think, also in different communities, right? We heard in our group about Israeli conversion and how there's a lot of politics involved here. There's also politics involved outside of Israel as well. So it is a very good question. It is quite complicated. So I hope that helps. I agree. I agree. Again, as I mentioned, I think that people who convert, I am so inspired and in awe of their choice to become Jewish, and I think that we need to support them in how in any way that we can. Unfortunately, there are sometimes I would say bureaucratic red tape that needs to be gone through, and I think it is terrible and unfortunate. And again, as I said, compassion and understanding and yeah, I agree. Just very difficult, and I think that we need to have a lot of love and support for these people. So with that, on that note, thank you all very much. Wishing you a wonderful week, and we will meet again next week, Be'ezrat Hashem. So wishing you all a good week. Shavua Tov.